Ashes of War and the Dawn of a New Economic Order. The period spanning from the conclusion of the Second World War in 1945 to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 encompasses arguably the most dramatic and consequential arc in the history of the global political economy. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the European continent lay in a state of unprecedented physical, economic, and institutional ruin. The conflict had devastated the infrastructure, transportation networks, and industrial capacity of the world's formerly preeminent economic powers, reducing per capita gross domestic product in many regions to a mere fraction of its pre-depression levels. Beyond the catastrophic loss of human life and the decimation of physical capital, the geopolitical landscape was fundamentally fractured by the encroaching realities of the Cold War, effectively dividing the continent into two competing spheres of ideological and economic influence governed by the United States and the Soviet Union. The very survival of democratic capitalism in Western Europe was entirely uncertain, plagued by the mass starvation, communist insurgency, and the total collapse of the international trading system. Yet, from this landscape of absolute devastation emerged a period of economic expansion and social stability so profound that it came to be universally recognized as the golden age of European capitalism, referred to in the French historical tradition as the Trente Glorieuses, or the 30 Glorious Years. Spanning roughly from the early 1950s to the systemic shocks of 1973, this era was characterized by an exceptional macroeconomic equilibrium. Western European economies expanded at an unprecedented average rate of nearly 5% per annum, a pace that effectively doubled the historical growth rates recorded between the dawn of the Industrial Revolution in 1820 and the outbreak of war in 1950. Furthermore, this spectacular expansion in output was accompanied by near-universal full employment across the continent. Nations such as West Germany and France not only absorbed their domestic labor forces entirely, but also experienced what economists termed overfull employment, drawing in millions of migrant workers to sustain their booming, labor-hungry industrial sectors. The cyclical crises of capitalism, which had repeatedly destabilized the global economy during the interwar period and precipitated the rise of fascism, appeared to have been fundamentally tamed. This stabilization was achieved through a masterful combination of deliberate state building, the construction of a robust international institutional architecture, and a novel, heavily mediated domestic compromise between the historically antagonistic forces of capital and labor. The state evolved from a passive observer of market forces into an active manager of macroeconomic demand, a provider of comprehensive social welfare, and an arbiter of industrial relations. Concurrently, European nations embarked on a historically unprecedented project of supranational integration, voluntarily pooling their sovereignty to secure peace and expand their markets. The anchor of the global economy, the Bretton Woods system. The foundational bedrock of the European Golden Age was laid not in Europe itself, but through the projection of American geopolitical and economic power, primarily manifested through the Bretton Woods monetary system. The architects of the post-war order, led by Harry Dexter White of the United States and John Maynard Keynes of the United Kingdom, were deeply haunted by the memory of the 1930s. They recognized that the aggressive protectionism, competitive currency devaluations, and mass unemployment of the Great Depression had directly facilitated the rise of totalitarianism and the subsequent outbreak of global conflict. Consequently, the overriding imperative of the post-war era was the creation of a stable, open, and multilateral international economic system that could forestall a relapse into economic nationalism and autarky. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 established the legal and institutional framework for this new global monetary system. It mandated a fixed but adjustable exchange rate, wherein all participating national currencies were pegged to the United States dollar, which was in turn unconditionally convertible to gold at a fixed parity of $35 per ounce. This system effectively made the United States dollar the world's reserve currency, anchoring the global economy to the immense productive capacity and gold reserves of the American state. To oversee this system and assist nations experiencing temporary balance of payment difficulties without resorting to destructive protectionist measures, the conference established two enduring institutions: the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which would later evolve into the World Bank. The Bretton Woods system was designed to provide the essential macroeconomic stability and predictability required for international trade and long-term capital investment to flourish. By eliminating the volatile currency fluctuations that had paralyzed international commerce in the interwar years, the fixed exchange rate regime gave European manufacturers the confidence to invest in export-oriented production. Furthermore, the system allowed for a degree of domestic policy autonomy. Because capital controls were permitted and widely utilized in the early post-war decades, European governments could pursue expansionary fiscal and monetary policies to ensure full employment without immediately suffering from devastating capital flight. This delicate balance between international monetary stability and domestic macroeconomic flexibility was the very essence of the post-war economic consensus. The American Catalyst, the Marshall Plan, and European Recovery. Despite the theoretical elegance of the Bretton Woods architecture, the immediate grim reality of Europe threatened to derail this ambitious global system before it could be fully implemented. Europe faced a severe and debilitating dollar gap. Because European industrial and agricultural production had collapsed, nations desperately needed to import food, fuel, and capital goods from the United States simply to survive the harsh winters and begin the process of rebuilding. Yet having exhausted their gold and foreign exchange reserves to finance the war effort, European nations entirely lacked the dollars required to purchase these vital American exports. Without immediate and massive intervention, Europe faced the prospect of economic starvation, societal collapse, and in the eyes of American policymakers, inevitable vulnerability to domestic communist subversion or direct Soviet expansion. In response to this existential geopolitical and economic crisis, United States Secretary of State George Marshall delivered his historic address at Harvard University on June 5, 1947. In this speech, he issued an urgent call for a massive, coordinated injection of American financial assistance to rebuild the European continent. Fanned by the fear of communist expansion and the rapid deterioration of European economies, the United States Congress formalized this vision by passing the Economic Cooperation Act in March 1948, initiating the European Recovery Program, universally known as the Marshall Plan. Over the subsequent 4 years, the Marshall Plan transferred approximately $13 billion, primarily in the form of outright grants rather than loans, to Western European economies. This financial commitment represented an extraordinary transfer of wealth, amounting to roughly 1% of the United States gross national product annually during its operation. The economic impact of the Marshall Plan was profound, though historical interpretations of its precise mechanisms and overall necessity have evolved over time. The direct financial injection immediately eased the paralyzing dollar shortage, allowing European states to purchase essential raw materials, modern machinery, and food supplies without triggering hyperinflation or enduring further draconian rationing. Furthermore, the aid catalyzed a dramatic increase in industrial production, particularly contributing to the rapid renewal of heavy industries, such as steel and chemical engineering. During the period of the Marshall Plan's operation, participating European nations saw their gross domestic products rise by an estimated 15 to 25%, decisively breaking the cycle of post-war stagnation. However, as later economic historians and institutionalists have emphasized, the Marshall Plan's most vital contribution was perhaps less about the raw volume of physical capital provided, and more about the institutional and political leverage it exerted. In many regions, particularly in West Germany, a significant portion of the industrial capital stock had actually survived the strategic bombing campaigns in surprisingly robust condition. The primary barrier to production was a lack of raw materials, broken supply chains, and political paralysis. The Marshall Plan addressed this by conditioning American aid on rigorous European cooperation. The United States mandated that recipient nations coordinate their recovery efforts, share resources, and begin the arduous process of dismantling the suffocating network of bilateral trade agreements and tariffs that choked intra-European commerce. This American imperative led directly to the creation of the Organization for European Economic Cooperation and the European Payments Union. The European Payments Union, established in 1950, was a particularly crucial mechanism. It provided a multilateral clearing system that allowed European nations to trade with one another using credits rather than scarce dollars or gold, significantly facilitating the simultaneous reduction of exchange controls within Europe. By forcing European states to abandon bilateral barter trade in favor of multilateral economic integration, the Marshall Plan effectively institutionalized a liberal economic order. It locked Western Europe into the expanding sphere of American-led global capitalism, marginalized the political influence of domestic communist parties in France and Italy, and provided the psychological and institutional momentum necessary for Europe to eventually pursue its own, deeper forms of political and economic union. The political drivers of early integration, forging the ECSC. While the Marshall Plan provided the external financial stimulus and the geopolitical umbrella for recovery, the internal architecture of European stability required a radical and permanent reimagining of the traditional nation-state. The disastrous effects of the Second World War, which followed scarcely 2 decades after the carnage of the First World War, clearly demonstrated that the Westphalian system of absolute national sovereignty, combined with the bitter historical enmity between France and Germany, was inherently unstable and prone to catastrophic violence. The political and economic drivers of early European integration were thus inextricably linked by a fundamental strategic dilemma. The continent desperately required the revival of German industrial might to fuel the broader European economic recovery. Yet France and other neighboring states were terrified of allowing a resurgent, fully sovereign Germany to eventually rearm and threaten its neighbors once again. The intellectual and diplomatic breakthrough that resolved this dilemma arrived on May 9, 1950, when French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman issued what became known as the Schuman Declaration. Acting on a highly innovative blueprint designed by the visionary French technocrat Jean Monnet, Schuman proposed a revolutionary concept: pooling the entire coal and steel production of France and West Germany under a single independent supranational authority, and leaving this organization open to the participation of other European countries. The logic behind this sector-specific integration was profound. Coal and steel were the foundational materials of modern industrial economies, the bloodline of economic recovery, and crucially, the indispensable prerequisites for the manufacture of munitions and the waging of war. By inextricably entangling these specific sectors, the Schuman Plan sought to make war between France and Germany not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. This bold initiative culminated in the Treaty of Paris, signed on April 18, 1951, which formally established the ECSC. The ECSC was an unprecedented entity in international law. It was the world's first true supranational organization, comprising 6 founding members:
France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. For the first time in modern history, sovereign European states voluntarily agreed to permanently delegate specific, vital aspects of their economic governance to a higher authority. The institutional framework of the ECSC was revolutionary and served as the direct precursor to the modern European Union. At its core was the High Authority, an independent executive body composed of technocrats rather than national representatives. Led initially by Jean Monnet himself, the High Authority was empowered to make binding decisions based on majority voting, manage investments, enforce strict rules regarding price transparency, and unilaterally ban anti-competitive cartels within the coal and steel sectors. To balance and legitimize this powerful supranational executive, the Treaty of Paris also created a special Council of Ministers representing the national governments, a common assembly composed of national parliamentarians to provide democratic oversight, and a court of justice to definitively arbitrate legal disputes arising from the treaty's implementation. By 1954, the ECSC had successfully removed nearly all barriers to trade in coal, coke, steel, pig iron, and scrap iron among its members, leading to a dramatic rise in the cross-border exchange of these vital commodities, and proving that supranational economic integration was practically viable. From the EDC collapse to the Treaties of Rome. The initial success of the European coal and steel community generated immense optimism among the proponents of European federalism, who believed that integration in one technical sector would inevitably spill over into other areas, gradually weaving the continent into a United States of Europe. Driven by the context of the Cold War and the American demand for West German rearmament to counter the Soviet threat, European leaders attempted to replicate the supranational model in the highly sensitive realm of military and foreign policy. In 1952, the 6 European coal and steel community members signed a treaty to create a European defense community, which envisioned a fully integrated European army, supplemented by a proposed European political community. However, this ambitious leap toward full political union proved premature. On August 30, 1954, the French National Assembly, deeply fearful of losing sovereignty over its national armed forces and harboring lingering anxieties regarding German rearmament, decisively refused to ratify the European Defense Community Treaty. The collapse of the defense community was a profound shock to the integration process, demonstrating the strict limits of supranationalism when confronting the core prerogatives of the traditional nation-state. Jean Monnet resigned from the high authority of the ECSC in protest, and the entire European project appeared to be paralyzed by resurgent nationalism. Recognizing that military and political integration was currently impossible, the architects of Europe were forced to execute a strategic pivot back to the realm of economics to salvage the integration process. This vital redirection was formalized at the Messina Conference, held in Sicily from June 1 to June 3, 1955. Convened by the proactive Italian Foreign Minister Gaetano Martino, the conference brought together the foreign ministers of the 6 ECSC nations to intensely debate the future trajectory of European cooperation. The debates at Messina were characterized by a profound strategic division regarding the optimal method of integration. Jean Monnet and his supporters advocated for continued vertical sectoral integration, arguing that the community method should be applied to newly emerging, highly technical industries. Specifically, they proposed the creation of a supranational community dedicated to the joint development of atomic energy, an area free from entrenched national monopolies and vital for future industrial power. Conversely, the Benelux countries, led forcefully by Dutch Foreign Minister Johan William Beyen and Belgian Foreign Minister Paul-Henri Spaak, championed a much broader horizontal approach. Drawing on a comprehensive memorandum, they proposed the creation of a general common market that would incrementally integrate the entire macroeconomic and trade structures of the member states, moving far beyond the isolated confines of coal and steel.
The resulting compromise at Messina embraced both visions, but historically favored the latter, proving to be the defining turning point in modern European history. The foreign ministers established an intergovernmental committee under the chairmanship of Paul-Henri Spaak to study the feasibility of both the atomic and the common market proposals. The exhaustive deliberations of the Spaak Committee culminated in the signing of the Treaties of Rome on March 25, 1957. These twin treaties established the European Atomic Energy Community, or Euratom, and, monumentally, the European Economic Community.
Unlike the narrowly focused ECSC treaty, the treaty establishing the European Economic Community committed the 6 member states to a fundamental and comprehensive recasting of their economic structures over an unlimited duration, granting the treaties a quasi-constitutional status.
The EEC mandated the progressive, phased elimination of all internal customs duties and quantitative quotas, aiming to forge a massive single market defined by the free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor. Furthermore, the treaty required the establishment of a common external tariff against third countries, creating a unified European trading bloc with immense leverage on the global stage. The EEC also laid the groundwork for the implementation of common policies in vital areas such as agriculture and transport, recognizing that true economic integration required more than just the removal of border tariffs. The institutions of the ECSC, the Executive, the Council, the Assembly, and the Court, were adapted and expanded to govern the new communities, cementing the unique, hybrid nature of European governance that balanced supranational ambition with intergovernmental reality. The Hague Summit of 1969, Completion, Deepening, and Widening. Throughout the 1960s, the European Economic Community achieved remarkable economic successes, abolishing internal tariffs 18 months ahead of schedule and overseeing a quadrupling of intra-community trade. However, the institutional development of the community was frequently paralyzed by the political stance of French President Charles de Gaulle. An ardent defender of the absolute primacy of the nation-state, de Gaulle fiercely resisted any expansion of supranational powers, famously boycotting the community institutions during the empty chair crisis of 1965 to force the retention of national vetoes. Furthermore, de Gaulle unilaterally vetoed the accession applications of the United Kingdom in 1963 and 1967, arguing that British entry would serve as a Trojan horse for American influence and fundamentally alter the continental character of the community. The resignation of Charles de Gaulle in 1969 removed the primary obstacle to the further evolution of the European project and set the stage for a dramatic revitalization of integration. His successor, Georges Pompidou, recognized that France required the dynamic economic strength of West Germany, now led by Chancellor Willy Brandt, to be balanced by the inclusion of the United Kingdom. Driven by these shifting geopolitical realities, Pompidou invited the heads of state and government to a historic summit in The Hague on December 1st and 2nd, 1969. The Hague Summit proved to be a masterclass in complex political issue linkage and represented a monumental leap forward for the community. The leaders agreed upon a tripartite agenda defined by 3 interdependent pillars: completion, deepening, and widening. First, to satisfy French demands, the summit agreed to complete the community by definitively establishing a system of independent own resources to finance the incredibly expensive common agricultural policy, removing it from the annual haggling over national contributions. Second, to address the growing monetary instability caused by the weakening of the US dollar, the leaders agreed to deepen integration by officially launching the objective of an economic and monetary union, instructing a committee led by Pierre Werner to draft a blueprint for a single European currency. Finally, and most visibly, the summit agreed to widen the community by formally opening accession negotiations with the United Kingdom, Denmark, Ireland, and Norway.
This historic decision culminated in the first enlargement of the European communities in 1973, expanding the bloc from the original 6 to 9 member states, and decisively linking the economic destiny of the British Isles to the European continent. By resolving the paralyzing disputes of the 1960s and setting an incredibly ambitious agenda for the future, the Hague Summit demonstrated the profound capacity of historical institutionalism to drive European integration forward through grand multidimensional compromises between sovereign states. Varieties of Capitalism, the theoretical framework. While the supranational architecture of the European Economic Community and the overarching global stability provided by the Bretton Woods system created the indispensable macro environment for the Golden Age, the actual mechanics of economic growth, wealth distribution, and social stability were determined emphatically at the national level. Contrary to monolithic conceptions of a singular, undifferentiated European or Western capitalist system, the post-war era witnessed the crystallization of highly distinct, deeply embedded institutional frameworks across the continent. These frameworks subsequently analyzed and categorized by comparative political economists through the influential Varieties of Capitalism paradigm, championed by Peter A. Hall and David Soskice, differentiated economies based on the specific mechanisms through which firms coordinated their activities. The Varieties of Capitalism approach posits that national economies are characterized by the presence of institutional complementarities, where the effectiveness of one institution, such as the financial system, is heavily dependent upon the presence and specific configuration of another institution, such as the industrial relations regime. The post-war period was uniquely defined by a broad underlying political consensus that explicitly recognized the mutual structural dependence of capital and labor. Capitalists fundamentally required a highly skilled, reliable workforce and broad societal stability to justify massive long-term investments in industrial capacity. Conversely, workers required continuous capital investment in advanced, sophisticated machinery to drive the sustained productivity gains that would ultimately finance rising real wages and the expansion of a comprehensive welfare state. However, the specific, legally codified mechanisms utilized to achieve and manage this delicate balance varied dramatically across Europe, broadly falling into 4 primary sub-regional models. The continental model of coordinated market economies, exemplified by West Germany, the social democratic or Nordic model, typified by Sweden, the liberal market economy model of the Anglo-Saxon sphere, represented by the United Kingdom, and the mixed market economy model of Mediterranean state capitalism found in France and Italy. Each of these distinct models crafted unique solutions to the problems of wage setting, skill formation, corporate governance, and the provision of social security. Coordinated market economies, West German Ordoliberalism. The spectacular economic resurgence of West Germany, universally dubbed the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, was underpinned by a highly specific, deeply philosophical, and rigorously institutionalized framework known as Ordoliberalism. Developed during the intellectual ferment of the 1930s and 1940s by the Freiburg School of Economics, led by prominent figures such as Walter Eucken, Ordoliberalism sought to navigate a perilous middle path between the destructive, chaotic, laissez-faire capitalism that had destabilized the Weimar Republic and the totalitarian, suffocating central planning of the Nazi and Soviet regimes. Unlike classical Anglo-Saxon liberalism, which inherently assumes that free markets naturally and inevitably tend to an optimal equilibrium without any state interference, the ordoliberals harbored a profound skepticism of corporate power. They postulated that markets, if left entirely to their own devices, are inherently prone to monopolization, cartelization, and systemic instability. Therefore, they argued that the state must play a strong, active, and vigilant role. Crucially, however, this role was not to direct economic outcomes, set prices, or centrally plan production. Rather, the state's supreme duty was to construct and fiercely defend a strict legal and institutional framework an inviolable order within which free, fair, and transparent competition could safely occur. Implemented forcefully and consistently by West Germany's first Minister of Economics and later Chancellor, Ludwig Erhard, this economic philosophy manifested practically as the social market economy. The social market economy combined an unwavering commitment to free enterprise, private property, and robust, stringent antitrust enforcement with an absolute dedication to price stability. This stability was guaranteed by the creation of a fiercely independent central bank, the Deutsche Bundesbank, which was constitutionally insulated from political pressure and mandated to prioritize the fight against inflation above all other macroeconomic goals. Crucially, the German model of coordinated market economy managed the eternal and potentially destructive divide between capital and labor through a deeply institutionalized, legally mandated system of industrial relations known as codetermination, Mitbestimmung. The history of German codetermination stretches back to the revolutionary upheavals following the First World War, but it was definitively solidified during the post-World War II reconstruction through a series of foundational codetermination bargains. These historic compromises were struck between a morally compromised business elite eager to prevent outright socialization of industry and a newly unified, highly disciplined trade union movement demanding a voice in economic governance. Codified initially in federal legislation in 1951, specifically for the strategically vital coal and steel sectors, and eventually expanded to encompass all massive corporate enterprises by the highly consequential Codetermination Act of 1976, this system fundamentally altered corporate governance.
The law mandated that employee and union representatives hold nearly half the seats on the supervisory boards, Aufsichtsrat, of major companies, effectively granting workers a direct, legally protected voice in strategic corporate decision-making alongside traditional shareholders. Complementing this high-level board representation was a dense network of powerful, legally recognized local works councils that meticulously negotiated shop floor conditions and technological implementations. This was further combined with highly structured, centralized wage bargaining conducted between massive, encompassing sectoral trade unions and powerful employers' associations. This intricate, overlapping network of coordination fostered profound institutional trust. It enabled a financial system characterized by patient capital, largely provided by relationship-based banks rather than volatile stock markets, allowing German industrial firms to prioritize long-term market share and incremental, high-quality innovation in capital goods and advanced manufacturing. Firms could invest heavily in highly specific vocational training for their employees, safe in the knowledge that these deeply integrated workers would not easily switch employers or resort to disruptive, unpredictable industrial action. The Nordic model, Sweden's Rehn-Meidner plan. In Northern Europe, and particularly in Sweden, the institutional balance of class power leaned much more heavily toward organized labor and the enduring political dominance of the Social Democratic Party. The Swedish economic trajectory during the Golden Age was defined by the implementation of the Rehn-Meidner model, an extraordinarily innovative and intellectually rigorous macroeconomic strategy. Developed in 1951 by two brilliant economists, Gösta Rehn and Rudolf Meidner, who were employed by the powerful Swedish Trade Union Confederation, LO, this model represented a coherent, structural alternative to standard Keynesian demand management. The Rehn-Meidner model was explicitly designed to simultaneously achieve four inherently contradictory macroeconomic goals that plagued all advanced economies: the maintenance of absolute full employment, the stimulation of high economic growth, the suppression of inflationary pressures, and the pursuit of radical income equality across the entire society. The central driving mechanism of this sophisticated model was the solidaristic wage policy. This policy was governed by the strict, egalitarian principle of equal pay for equal work,
completely regardless of the profitability, size, sector, or geographic location of the specific firm employing the worker. Negotiated strictly through highly centralized, national-level collective bargaining between the Apex Union Federation and the singular National Employers Association, this policy deliberately and systematically squeezed the wage differentials between high-skill and low-skill labor, and between highly profitable modern industries and highly inefficient legacy sectors. The macroeconomic effects of this solidaristic wage policy were profound, brutal, and structurally transformative. By forcing all companies across the entire national economy to pay a uniformly high standard living wage, the policy essentially acted as an instrument of rapid, state-sponsored corporate natural selection. Inefficient, low-productivity firms that could not afford to pay the nationally mandated high wages were deliberately driven into bankruptcy by the unions themselves. The labor movement intentionally accepted the destruction of these uncompetitive jobs as the necessary price of modernization. Conversely, highly productive, capital-intensive, and internationally competitive export firms benefited immensely from this system. Because their wage costs were artificially restrained by the national average, preventing local unions in highly profitable factories from extracting the full financial value of the firm's high productivity, these successful corporations accrued massive unutilized wage margins, or immense windfall profits. The government and the unions explicitly encouraged these firms to aggressively reinvest these excess profits into further technological expansion, capacity building, and research and development. To address the inevitable localized unemployment caused by the deliberate, policy-induced destruction of inefficient firms, the Rehn-Meidner model relied entirely on the state to implement aggressive, lavishly funded active labor market policies. The government provided massive financial support for the comprehensive retraining, upskilling, and geographic relocation of displaced workers, seamlessly and rapidly moving them from dying, low-value sectors into the highly productive, expanding, and technologically advanced export industries. This dynamic labor mobility, fundamentally supported by a universally generous, tax-funded welfare state, meant that Swedish workers enthusiastically embraced continuous technological disruption and industrial restructuring. They understood that their personal economic security and standard of living were guaranteed by the state and the union movement, rather than being precariously tied to the survival of a specific, potentially obsolete job. Through this intricate synthesis of centralized bargaining, wage equalization, and active labor market intervention, the Swedish model achieved staggering levels of industrial modernization, international competitiveness, and egalitarian wealth distribution throughout the decades of the Golden Age. Liberal market economies, the United Kingdom's post-war consensus. The United Kingdom represented the primary European example of a liberal market economy, diverging significantly in its institutional structure from the coordinated and negotiated models of its continental counterparts. The British post-war economic and social architecture was definitively shaped by the Attlee Settlement, an enduring legacy of the landslide electoral victory of Clement Attlee's Labour Party in 1945. This settlement established a broad, cross-party political consensus that endured for nearly 23 decades. It rested firmly on three foundational pillars: the implementation of the Revolutionary Beveridge Report's recommendations to create a comprehensive cradle-to-grave welfare state and the free-at-the-point-of-use National Health Service, the aggressive nationalization of key utilities and the commanding heights of heavy industry, including coal mining, railways, and steel production, and a strict overriding political commitment to maintaining absolute full employment through the active deployment of Keynesian macroeconomic demand management. However, unlike West Germany or Sweden, the United Kingdom fundamentally lacked the institutional mechanisms required for strategic, non-market coordination between firms, labor unions, and the state. British corporate governance was historically dominated by dispersed shareholder ownership and highly fluid short-term capital markets centered in the City of London. This financial architecture structurally prioritized immediate financial returns and high dividend payouts over the patient, long-term industrial investment strategies seen on the continent. Concurrently, the British labor movement, while possessing extremely high overall union density and immense undeniable political influence over the governing Labour Party, was highly decentralized, fragmented, and notoriously resistant to central authority. Unlike the disciplined, encompassing sectoral unions of Germany or Sweden, British collective bargaining was chaotic. It often occurred not at the national or even the industry level, but at the highly localized plant or shop floor level, driven by militant, fiercely independent shop stewards. This potent combination of short-termist financial capital seeking rapid returns and highly decentralized adversarial labor relations engaged in constant leapfrogging wage claims created profound underlying structural vulnerabilities within the British economy. Without the institutional capacity or union discipline to coordinate nationwide wage restraint during prolonged periods of full employment, successive British governments found themselves hopelessly trapped in destructive, recurring, stop-go economic cycles. Whenever the government stimulated the economy to lower unemployment, severe labor shortages emerged. Local union branches used their localized bargaining power to aggressively bid up wages far beyond underlying productivity gains. This inevitably triggered rapid domestic inflation and severe balance of payments crises, as British exports became uncompetitive and consumers imported cheaper foreign goods. To defend the value of the pound and halt the inflation, the government was then forced to aggressively contract the economy by raising taxes and interest rates, inducing a recession, only to restart the cycle a few years later. While the post-war consensus indubitably delivered rising absolute living standards, full employment, and vital social security for decades, its underlying institutional fragmentation left the British economy uniquely exposed and dangerously fragile as it approached the impending macroeconomic shocks of the late 20th century.
Mixed market economies, Mediterranean state capitalism in France and Italy. In stark contrast to the highly coordinated, rule-bound negotiation of Germany, the egalitarian, union-led industrial restructuring of Sweden, or the decentralized market mechanisms of the United Kingdom, the political economies of Southern Europe, most notably France and Italy, and eventually Spain following its democratic transition, developed as mixed market economies. These systems were characterized by profound, direct, and often highly politicized state intervention in the fundamental mechanisms of capital accumulation, industrial development, and labor regulation. In France, this interventionist tradition manifested as the renowned system of dirigisme. Emerging from the humiliation of defeat and the immediate post-war period under the towering guidance of Charles de Gaulle and the technocratic genius of Jean Monnet, the French state established the powerful Commissariat Général du Plan to oversee a comprehensive system of indicative macroeconomic planning. Recognizing that French private enterprise had historically underinvested, remained inherently conservative, and lagged dangerously behind German and American industrial efficiency, the French state took direct, unapologetic control of the nation's economic modernization. Through a series of sequential, highly detailed multi-year Monnet plans, the government utilized its immense bureaucratic power. It channeled massive volumes of directed, subsidized credit, allocated scarce physical resources, and utilized a sprawling portfolio of newly nationalized commercial banks, insurance companies, and heavy industries to force rapid, debt-financed investment into critical, strategic sectors such as electricity generation, transportation networks, and steel production. While private enterprise certainly continued to exist and eventually thrive,
French industrial policy became an intimate, highly exclusive affair between the elite echelons of the state bureaucracy and massive, often state-owned, national champion firms. This elite coordination explicitly and deliberately marginalized the influence of organized labor and smaller businesses in the overarching macroeconomic decision-making process. Italy pursued a related yet distinctly unique trajectory that facilitated its astonishing economic miracle between 1950 and 1963, transforming a devastated, deeply impoverished, and largely agrarian society into a dynamic global industrial powerhouse. Unlike other nations that nationalized industries post-war, the Italian Democratic Republic inherited a massive, ready-made portfolio of industrial assets from the defunct fascist regime, organized primarily under the immense umbrella of the Institute for Industrial Reconstruction, or IRI, and later the state-owned energy conglomerate ENI. Rather than privatizing these sprawling assets, the successive Christian Democrat-led governments utilized them aggressively to spearhead heavy industrialization in the underdeveloped South, build essential national infrastructure like the Autostrada network, and, most importantly, provide cheap, subsidized industrial inputs such as steel, chemicals, and energy to power the explosive, export-driven growth of dynamic private manufacturing firms located in the industrial triangle of the North, such as Fiat, Olivetti, and Pirelli. Labor relations in these Mediterranean mixed market economies were historically highly antagonistic, deeply ideologically divided, and intensely politicized. Because the state acted with a heavy shadow of hierarchy, employment relations were not primarily governed by cooperative, bipartite collective bargaining, but rather by rigid, highly complex, state-imposed legal codes. The resulting system was inherently protective of insiders, workers fortunate enough to secure permanent, open-ended contracts in massive state bureaucracies or large, unionized industrial enterprises. These insiders enjoyed stringent employment protection legislation, making dismissal incredibly difficult. Conversely, this system left peripheral workers, youth, and employees in small enterprises highly vulnerable. This structural dualism resulted in frequent, highly disruptive, and massive waves of industrial conflict. Trade unions, which were often directly aligned with powerful domestic communist or socialist political parties, frequently used massive political strikes and societal disruption rather than institutionalized board-level coordination to force concessions from the state and advance their broader ideological interests. The statistical narrative, OECD indicators of the Golden Age. The profound impact of these varied institutional arrangements and the overarching stability of the Golden Age is vividly illustrated by the historical economic indicators compiled by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. A careful analysis of the data from 1950 through the late 1980s reveals a narrative of initial expansion followed by structural maturation and growing fiscal pressure. The most striking feature of the Golden Age data is the sheer magnitude and consistency of economic growth. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the economies of Western Europe achieved growth rates that remain historically unparalleled. The gross domestic product of the region expanded at an average real rate of over 4% annually, with nations like West Germany and Italy frequently recording annual growth rates exceeding 6 or even 7% during their respective miracle phases. This phenomenal expansion of aggregate output resulted in a massive, visible increase in absolute living standards, effectively eliminating the extreme poverty that had plagued much of the continent prior to the war, and giving rise to the modern European consumer society. Parallel to this explosive economic growth was the monumental expansion of the tax state. as European governments committed themselves to the provision of comprehensive universal welfare states, national healthcare systems, expanded higher education, and extensive public infrastructure, the financial requirements of the state grew exponentially. OECD historical statistics demonstrate a relentless upward trajectory in taxation rates across all European models. In the early 1950s, total tax-to-GDP ratios in many European nations hovered in the low 20s. However, as the commitments of the Keynesian consensus expanded, these ratios climbed steadily throughout the 1960s and 1970s. By the late 1980s, the tax burden in the European Union area had reached levels significantly higher than in other advanced economies like the United States or Japan, with Nordic nations like Sweden pushing their tax-to-GDP ratios beyond 50% to fund their expansive social democratic models. This rising taxation directly mirrored the explosive growth in public spending. The state transition from a night watchman role to an active macroeconomic manager resulted in public expenditure commanding an ever-increasing share of national output. While this spending successfully underpinned social peace and eradicated the worst extremes of inequality, it also introduced long-term structural rigidities that would become highly problematic during periods of economic stagnation. Furthermore, the data reveals a fascinating trajectory regarding the balance of class power measured through the proxy of trade union density. Benefiting from the tight labor markets of the full employment era and the political legitimacy granted by the post-war consensus, union membership swelled across Europe. However, the exact levels of unionization varied drastically depending on the institutional variety of capitalism. In the Nordic countries, where the administration of unemployment benefits was often linked to union membership, the Ghent system, union density reached extraordinary heights, often exceeding 70 or 80% of the active workforce. In the United Kingdom and Germany, density remained robust, hovering around the 40 to 50% mark throughout the 1970s. Yet, the OECD data clearly marks the late 1970s as the high watermark for organized labor. Following the economic crises of the 1970s and the subsequent neoliberal restructuring of the 1980s, union density began a precipitous, uninterrupted decline across nearly all OECD nations, halving in many countries as heavy industry collapsed and the service sector expanded. The breakdown of the Keynesian consensus, the crises of the 1970s. The delicate institutional equilibrium, unprecedented economic growth, and social peace that sustained the Golden Age began to show severe signs of strain in the late 1960s and shattered entirely over the course of the turbulent 1970s. This historic crisis was not the result of a single failure, but rather triggered by a confluence of monumental external shocks that violently destroyed the stable macroeconomic environment upon which the post-war European consensus entirely relied. The first decisive and fatal blow was the collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary system, the very anchor of post-war stability. By the late 1960s, massive systemic United States balance of payments deficits, driven primarily by the explosive domestic social spending of the Great Society programs and the immense inflationary costs of the Vietnam War, had flooded the global economy with excess dollars. This massive dollar overhang rendered the fundamental promise of gold convertibility at $35 an ounce increasingly untenable, leading to massive speculative attacks against the dollar. Recognizing the unsustainability of the situation, in August 1971, United States President Richard Nixon unilaterally suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold, effectively and permanently terminating the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates. The ensuing transition to a chaotic system of floating fiat currencies introduced unprecedented volatility,
uncertainty, and speculative risk into international trade and financial markets, deeply destabilizing the highly attuned export-driven economic models of European states. This profound monetary instability was immediately compounded by severe, devastating supply shocks in the global energy market. In October 1973, in direct political response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries instituted a punitive oil embargo and successfully quadrupled the global price of crude oil almost overnight. A second, equally devastating price shock followed the Iranian Revolution in 1979. For Western European economies, which had rebuilt their vast industrial complexes upon the assumption of eternally cheap imported Middle Eastern oil, the immediate macroeconomic effect was catastrophic. The shocks acted as a massive tax on the European economy, draining national wealth, creating terrifying balance of payments deficits, and forcing a sudden, violent contraction in industrial output and consumer demand. The violent collision of monetary collapse and energy shortages generated a terrifying new macroeconomic phenomenon that fundamentally broke the reigning intellectual paradigm of Keynesian economics, stagflation. Throughout the entirety of the post-war era, policymakers and economists had confidently relied on the Phillips curve, an empirical observation which posited a stable, reliable, and inverse trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Orthodox Keynesian theory dictated clear binary policy responses. If unemployment rose, governments should utilize deficit fiscal spending and monetary expansion to stimulate aggregate demand. Conversely, if inflation rose, they should raise taxes and interest rates to contract spending. Stagflation, however, presented the simultaneous paradoxical explosion of both rampant inflation and soaring unemployment. When well-intentioned governments instinctively reached for their Keynesian toolkits and attempted to spend their way out of the oil-induced recessions, they found that stimulating aggregate demand in a supply-constrained environment was disastrous. They merely poured newly printed money into economies that lacked the energy to increase production, drastically accelerating inflation to double-digit levels without creating any sustainable employment. The intellectual consensus was shattered. The very economic levers that had seemingly banished the business cycle now appeared to only exacerbate the crisis. The stagflation dilemma and the Kaleckian profit squeeze. Beneath the immediate visible impact of the external oil and currency shocks lay a deeper, more insidious structural crisis rooted in the very success and longevity of the Golden Age itself. This dynamic was theoretically described by post-Keynesian economists as the Kaleckian dilemma, named after the Polish economist Michał Kalecki, who had accurately predicted it decades earlier. Kalecki had argued that while full employment could technically be achieved through government spending, maintaining it permanently would eventually prove politically and socially impossible due to the shifting balance of class power. Decades of continuous, guaranteed full employment in Europe had fundamentally altered this balance heavily in favor of organized labor. Workers, no longer disciplined by the existential fear of mass unemployment or the presence of a reserve army of labor, became increasingly militant and utilized their immense bargaining power to demand continuous, aggressive wage increases, enhanced working conditions, and greater control over the production process. In the highly inflationary environment of the 1970s, triggered by the oil shocks, this enhanced labor power resulted in severe, destructive wage price spirals. As the cost of living surged due to soaring energy prices, powerful trade unions fought fiercely to protect their members' real incomes, utilizing the threat of massive national strikes to extract wage increases that matched or exceeded inflation. Employers, initially attempting to maintain industrial peace, simply conceded to these wage demands and subsequently raised the prices of their goods to cover the exploding wage bills,
further accelerating the inflationary cycle. Ultimately, however, European capital hit a breaking point. In an increasingly competitive, globalized market, firms could not endlessly pass all increased wage and energy costs onto consumers without destroying their market share. The inevitable result was a devastating systemic squeeze on corporate profitability across the continent. In the United Kingdom, to cite the most extreme example, the rate of return on industrial capital collapsed precipitously from over 35% in 1973 to an unsustainable 10% by 1975. Across Europe, falling profits utterly destroyed the basic incentive for private investment. This led to a collapse in capital formation, widespread industrial closures, plummeting productivity growth, and the definitive end of the historic cooperative compromise between capital and labor that had governed and sustained the post-war era. Divergent adaptations, Thatcherism, and the neoliberal turn in the UK. Faced with the absolute intellectual collapse of the Keynesian consensus and the material reality of the profitability crisis, European states were forced into deeply painful, highly contested processes of adaptation. Because the varieties of capitalism across the continent were structurally and historically distinct, the political and economic responses to the crisis of the 1970s diverged significantly, fundamentally reshaping the political and economic landscape of Europe for the remainder of the century. In the liberal market economy of the UK, the crisis of the 1970s manifested as an acute systemic collapse. The Conservative government's barber boom of the early 1970s, a reckless attempt to aggressively inflate the economy out of rising unemployment through massive tax cuts and spending increases, resulted in an absolute economic catastrophe. Inflation peaked at an astonishing 24% in 1975, and the public sector deficit exploded to post-war record levels. The economic deterioration reached such a humiliating nadir that the subsequent Labour government was forced to seek a massive bailout from the International Monetary Fund in 1976, initiating the very first waves of severe, politically agonizing public spending cuts. The total failure of the British state to manage the militant demands of its decentralized, fragmented trade unions culminated in the paralyzing nationwide strikes of 1978 to 1979 Winter of Discontent, an event that utterly discredited the post-war Keynesian consensus in the eyes of the British electorate. This environment of total systemic failure and social chaos paved the way for the historic election of Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in 1979, ushering in a radical, paradigm-shifting transition from Keynesianism to neoliberalism. Thatcherism represented a deliberate, fierce, and ideological dismantling of the entire post-war Attlee settlement. Convinced that state intervention was the cause of the disease rather than the cure, her government formally abandoned the historic commitment to full employment.
In its place, she instituted strict, uncompromising monetarist policies inspired by Milton Friedman, designed exclusively to crush inflation by severely restricting the money supply and raising interest rates to punishingly high levels. Furthermore, Thatcher recognized that restoring corporate profitability required breaking the structural power of the labor movement. She launched a relentless, highly coordinated legislative assault on the institutional power of organized labor, implementing restrictive trade union acts that mandated secret ballots, outlawed secondary picketing, and severely limited the legal right to strike. Combined with the rapid ideological privatization of massive state-owned industries, including telecommunications, steel, and energy, and the aggressive deregulation of financial markets in the 1986 Big Bang, these policies forced a brutal, traumatic restructuring of the British economy. Uncompetitive, unionized heavy manufacturing sectors in the north of England were allowed to entirely collapse, leading to mass long-term unemployment and profound permanent deindustrialization. Simultaneously, the entire national economy was aggressively reoriented around the booming, highly lucrative, and deregulated financial services sector concentrated in the City of London. Thatcherism successfully destroyed inflation and restored profitability, but at the cost of immense social inequality and the permanent destruction of the industrial working class. French U-turn and the limits of national Keynesianism. While the United Kingdom embraced the neoliberal revolution, the mixed market economies of the Mediterranean initially attempted to navigate the stagflation crisis through political maneuvering and doubled-down state intervention, before ultimately colliding violently with the unyielding limits of their national models in an increasingly globalized world. France provided the most dramatic, closely watched ideological pivot of the entire era. In 1981, amidst the deepening global recession, the French electorate swept the Socialist Party into power, electing President François Mitterrand on a radically left-wing platform. Mitterrand embarked on a massive, unilateral Keynesian expansion program that was completely out of step with the tightening, anti-inflationary policies being pursued by Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and the Bundesbank in West Germany. Attempting to construct a French road to socialism and spend the nation out of the recession, Mitterrand dramatically increased minimum wages, vastly expanded social welfare benefits, mandated a shorter working week, and launched a sweeping, historic program of nationalization, taking direct state control of virtually all major banks and several massive industrial conglomerates to shield them from global market pressures and direct their investments. This bold attempt at socialism in one country rapidly and spectacularly imploded. Because the rest of the world was in recession, the massive injection of domestic demand in France did not stimulate French industry. Rather, it merely sucked in a massive wave of foreign imports, as French consumers used their higher wages to buy German and Japanese goods. This led to disastrous, exploding trade deficits, a terrifying hemorrhage of capital flight, and intense, relentless speculative attacks against the French currency. The franc was forced into 3 humiliating devaluations within the European monetary system between 1981 and 1983. Facing absolute economic ruin, an exhausted foreign exchange reserve, and the very real prospect of being forced to withdraw from the European monetary system entirely, which would have shattered the core of the Franco-German alliance, Mitterrand capitulated. In March 1983, he enacted the famous Tournant de la Rigueur, or the austerity turn. It was a total reversal of policy. The French state abruptly abandoned its grand Keynesian ambitions, formally halted the automatic indexation of wages to inflation, slashed public spending, raised taxes, and declared that a strong currency and anti-inflationary rigor were now the absolute priorities of the Republic in order to maintain its strategic, indispensable alignment with West Germany. The austerity turn was a watershed moment in European history. It effectively signaled the definitive end of traditional, isolated French dirigisme, explicitly acknowledging that in an increasingly integrated, financially open European economy, no single European nation, no matter how proud or powerful, could successfully execute an isolated, expansionary macroeconomic policy against the dictates of global financial markets. In contrast to the ideological turbulence in Britain and France, West Germany's coordinated market economy demonstrated remarkable, enviable institutional resilience during the stagflation crisis. The deep-seated, historically rooted Ordoliberal commitment to price stability, rigorously enforced by the fiercely independent Bundesbank, ensured that German inflation remained significantly lower than the OECD average throughout the volatile decade. Moreover, the highly institutionalized system of co-determination proved its immense macroeconomic worth. Faced with the reality of external energy shocks and slowing growth,
German trade unions and employers' associations did not engage in the destructive warfare seen in Britain. Instead, they utilized their dense, legally mandated networks of communication to coordinate moderate, highly responsible wage settlements. The unions deliberately prioritized the preservation of long-term international competitiveness and high-quality employment over destructive short-term wage spirals. While West Germany still undeniably suffered from slower overall growth and slowly rising unemployment during the 1970s and 1980s, its underlying coordinated industrial model remained fundamentally intact, allowing the nation to effortlessly consolidate its position as the undisputed, unmatched economic hegemon of the European continent. Overcoming Eurosclerosis, the Single European Act of 1986. By the mid-1980s, the prolonged economic stagnation, soaring unemployment, and structural rigidities exposed by the crises of the 1970s had generated a pervasive, deeply pessimistic atmosphere across the continent, widely diagnosed as Eurosclerosis. There was a palpable, growing fear among political elites that the fractured, highly regulated, and heavily taxed European economies were falling permanently and irreversibly behind the dynamic, deregulating markets of the United States and the rapidly ascending, highly efficient industrial power of Japan. Having painfully recognized the absolute futility of national-level Keynesian solutions, as dramatically demonstrated by the French experience in 1983, European political and economic elites forged a new consensus. They recognized that the only viable path to restoring continental growth and global competitiveness lay in a massive, coordinated supply-side liberalization, which could only be achieved by a radical deepening of European integration. This realization culminated in the drafting and signing of the Single European Act in 1986, representing the very first major comprehensive revision of the foundational treaties of Rome since their inception 30 decades earlier. Driven by the energetic, visionary leadership of European Commission President Jacques Delors, strongly supported by a newly emboldened European Parliament and backed by an alliance of European multinational corporations, the SEA established a legally binding, historic objective to complete a truly borderless, single market by the deadline of December 31, 1992. The Single European Act represented a profound structural and philosophical transformation of the European capitalist landscape. It aimed to ruthlessly eliminate thousands of hidden, protectionist, non-trading barriers, forcefully harmonize disparate national technical standards, and fully, irrevocably liberalize the cross-border flow of capital, services, and labor. To ensure that stubborn national vetoes could not obstruct this massive continental deregulatory program, the Act fundamentally altered the community's core governance structure by significantly extending qualified majority voting within the Council of Ministers to a broad range of single market issues, effectively ending the era of absolute national vetoes over economic regulation. While the ambitious creation of the single market successfully unleashed a powerful, transformative wave of corporate restructuring, cross-border mergers, and renewed economic dynamism across the continent, it fundamentally altered the historic, carefully managed balance between capital and labor that had defined the Golden Age. By removing all legal barriers to capital mobility, the integrated European market vastly increased the structural power of multinational corporations. It allowed capital to easily threaten to relocate production to jurisdictions within the bloc with lower taxes and more flexible labor regulations, thereby exerting intense, permanent downward pressure on domestic wage bargaining systems and traditional welfare state commitments. Consequently, the late 1980s marked the definitive historic transition from the era of embedded, state-managed capitalism, where national governments shielded their populations from the harshest outcomes of the market, to a new, far more rigorous paradigm of hyper-competitive, market-driven integration.
The very success of the single market project inevitably generated an unstoppable political and economic momentum for the next logical yet monumental step in European integration, the pursuit of a single currency to permanently eliminate exchange rate volatility and transaction costs within the internal market. The structural groundwork established by the Single European Act in the 1980s thus flowed directly and inevitably into the creation of the Economic and Monetary Union and the signing of the Maastricht Treaty in the early 1990s, permanently binding the diverse varieties of European capitalism into a rigid, irrevocable monetary architecture.
Architecture of the European Polycrisis. The European Union currently navigates an unprecedented historical juncture defined by the concept of the Polycrisis, a term popularized by former European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker in 2016 and further conceptualized by historians and sustainability scholars to describe the complex, interactive nature of modern global challenges. The Polycrisis framework describes the simultaneous occurrence and temporal overlap of multiple distinct shocks, ranging from sovereign debt emergencies and mass migration to geopolitical conflict, energy supply disruptions, and pandemic-induced economic paralysis. These crises interact, feed upon one another, and multiply their overall impact across the continent, creating positive and negative interdependencies that fundamentally challenge the existing governance structures of the European Union. Unlike isolated historical disruptions, the European Polycrisis exposes the profound structural vulnerabilities inherent in the original design of the Economic and Monetary Union, laying bare the consequences of integrating a continent monetarily without integrating it fiscally or politically. The foundational architecture of the Economic and Monetary Union, established by the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, embarked upon the ambitious and historically unprecedented project of forging a single currency zone across highly diverse national economies. By centralizing monetary policy under the independent European Central Bank while leaving fiscal, structural, and wage policies strictly within the sovereign domain of national governments, the European project inadvertently engineered a structural divergence between its highly competitive, export-oriented core nations and its domestic demand-driven peripheral nations. Over the past 3 decades, this architectural asymmetry has reshaped the political economy of Europe in profound ways. It has transformed asymmetric macroeconomic shocks into devastating social crises, fundamentally altered traditional European welfare states through mandated austerity, fueled the geographical concentration of discontent that drives contemporary populism, and forced a radical, ongoing reimagining of European state aid and industrial policy in response to global geopolitical fragmentation. The Foundations of Divergence, Maastricht and the Illusion of Convergence, 1992 to 1999. The transition to the euro was predicated on the foundational assumption that a single currency would inherently foster real economic convergence among member states. The Maastricht Treaty established strict nominal convergence criteria for prospective members, mandating price stability, sustainable public finances, exchange rate stability, and converging long-term interest rates. Specifically, the fiscal criterion required member states to maintain budget deficits below 3% of their gross domestic product and public debt levels below 60%, rules that were later codified into the Stability and Growth Pact. This framework was heavily influenced by the economic orthodoxy of the era and the political imperatives of Northern European states, particularly Germany. A central selling point for the Economic and Monetary Union in Germany was the absolute insistence that the euro would have no fiscal implications, leading to the strict inclusion of a no bailout clause, stipulating that member states would not guarantee each other's debt. However, the pursuit of nominal convergence masked a fundamental failure to ensure real economic convergence.
The optimal currency area theory, pioneered by economist Robert Mundell, posits that countries sharing a currency must be sufficiently similar in their economic structures to avoid asymmetric shocks, or they must possess highly flexible labor and product markets to adjust to such shocks in the absence of a national exchange rate. European policymakers largely believed that the single market and the introduction of the single currency would endogenously generate these optimal conditions, forcing structural transformations that would make poorer peripheral countries resemble higher-income core countries, thereby reducing adjustment costs. The fragility of this assumption was violently exposed in the run-up to the euro during the exchange rate mechanism crisis of 1992. Driven by the asymmetrical macroeconomic shock of German reunification, the Bundesbank aggressively hiked interest rates to curb domestic inflation, fueled by the conversion of East German marks and massive fiscal transfers. Other European nations, bound by the exchange rate mechanism, were forced to match these high German interest rates to maintain their currency pegs, despite facing completely different domestic economic conditions, including high unemployment and sluggish growth. This severe monetary misalignment forced the United Kingdom and Italy to withdraw their currencies from the exchange rate mechanism on September 16, 1992, a day famously remembered as Black Wednesday. The crisis triggered a wave of speculative attacks and devaluations across Europe, illustrating the inherent vulnerability of pegging disparate economies to a rigid monetary framework without fiscal transfers. France, pursuing its franc fort policy to maintain parity with the Deutschmark as a political imperative for European integration, endured agonizingly high interest rates and suppressed economic growth solely to prove its commitment to monetary discipline. Despite the stark warnings provided by Black Wednesday and the subsequent widening of the exchange rate mechanism bands, the political momentum for integration prevailed, and the euro was launched in 1999, initiating an era of unprecedented financial liberalization and cross-border capital movement that would set the stage for a continent-wide crisis. The era of illusion, capital flows, trade imbalances, and core-periphery divergence, 1999 to 2008. The introduction of the euro in 1999 unleashed a wave of financial market liberalization and initiated a decade of profound, yet ultimately unsustainable economic divergence. The immediate effect of the single currency was a dramatic and rapid convergence of sovereign bond yields across the Eurozone. Financial markets essentially treated all Eurozone sovereign debt as risk-free, pricing the bonds of peripheral nations such as Greece, Spain, and Italy at nearly the same historically low yields as German bunds. This elimination of perceived exchange rate risk and the dramatic lowering of borrowing costs in the peripheral economies triggered massive cross-border capital flows from the capital-rich core nations, primarily Germany, the Netherlands, and Austria, to the capital-poor peripheral nations, including Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland. Eurostat data from this period highlights a massive expansion of external assets, which more than doubled from roughly 50% of gross domestic product at the signing of the Maastricht Treaty to over 100% by 1999 and exceeded 300% by the outbreak of the global financial crisis. This monumental influx of capital into the periphery, however, did not primarily finance productive, export-enhancing investments or technological innovation. Instead, it fueled massive debt-driven expansions in non-tradable sectors. In Spain and Ireland, cheap credit fueled gargantuan housing and real estate bubbles, while in Greece and Portugal, it financed rapidly rising public and private consumption. Between 1999 and 2008, peripheral nations experienced robust but entirely debt-fueled growth, averaging growth rates far above those of the core, while simultaneously accumulating vast external trade imbalances. Eurostat macroeconomic panel data tracking current account balances reveals the depth of this divergence. Greece's current account deficit widened massively from roughly 5% of its gross domestic product in 1999 to nearly 15% by 2008. Portugal's current account deficit averaged nearly 10% over the same decade. Conversely, core economies, particularly Germany and the Netherlands, accumulated massive corresponding current account surpluses, essentially financing the consumption of the periphery through their own export dominance. This structural divergence is best understood through the Varieties of Capitalism framework and structuralist political economy, which categorizes countries based on their institutional arrangements regarding labor markets, corporate governance, and innovation systems. Germany, operating as a coordinated market economy, underwent a period of painful but highly effective structural adjustment following the creation of the Eurozone. Between 2003 and 2005, the German government implemented the Hartz IV labor market reforms, which completely overhauled the German unemployment insurance system. The reforms merged unemployment assistance and social assistance into a single, less generous, flat-rate welfare benefit for the long-term unemployed, drastically reducing the reservation wage and intensifying the pressure on unemployed individuals to accept low-wage or part-time employment. Accompanied by cooperative wage restraint agreements between powerful trade unions and employers' associations, Germany successfully suppressed nominal unit labor costs. This internal devaluation within a fixed exchange rate regime made German manufacturing hyper-competitive on the global stage, allowing the nation to establish a dominant export-driven growth model without relying on debt or government deficits. In stark contrast, the peripheral economies experienced rapidly rising unit labor costs during the same period. Furthermore, countries like Italy, Portugal, and Greece specialized in lower technology, labor-intensive goods that became highly exposed to intensifying global competition, particularly after the integration of China and other emerging economies into the global trading system. As a result, the pre-crisis decade saw the Eurozone split into a rigid core-periphery divide, with the core operating close to full employment through industrial and export dominance, while the periphery masked deep underlying industrial stagnation and secular decline with unsustainable, debt-financed domestic consumption. The Eurozone debt crisis and the imposition of the austerity paradigm. The structural contradictions of the economic and monetary union were violently exposed by the global financial crisis of 2008. What began as a subprime mortgage crisis in the United States rapidly mutated into a sovereign debt and banking crisis in Europe due to the fundamental flaws of the Eurozone architecture, specifically the absence of a fiscal union and the sudden stop of cross-border capital flows. As global risk appetite evaporated, Northern European banks and financial institutions abruptly halted lending to the periphery, precipitating a severe and immediate liquidity crisis. Without a national central bank to act as a sovereign lender of last resort, or the ability to devalue a national currency to absorb the macroeconomic shock, peripheral states found themselves trapped in a vicious, self-reinforcing feedback loop between insolvent domestic banking sectors and increasingly indebted national governments. The crisis struck the periphery with devastating force, unraveling a decade of apparent economic progress. In late 2009, the Greek government revealed that its headline fiscal deficit was actually 12.8% of its gross domestic product, far higher than previously estimated, a figure that eventually reached an astonishing 15.6%. Greece's gross government debt surged to over 126% of its gross domestic product, cutting the nation off entirely from international bond markets. Ireland, previously heralded as the Celtic tiger for its rapid economic expansion, saw its headline fiscal balance collapse from a surplus to a staggering deficit of 13.8% in 2009, as the state was forced to issue a blanket guarantee to save its imploding banking sector following the catastrophic bursting of its property bubble. Portugal, suffering from chronic low productivity growth and high external debt, was similarly cut off from market financing, as its sovereign bond yields soared above 6% over German benchmarks. Spain experienced a devastating collapse of its construction sector, leading to immense private debt overhangs being transferred to the public balance sheet, triggering a massive unemployment crisis. To prevent the total disintegration of the monetary union and to shield core European banks from catastrophic losses on peripheral debt, European authorities and the International Monetary Fund formed the Troika, comprising the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. The Troika administered massive bailout programs for Greece, Ireland, and Portugal, followed by targeted banking sector rescues for Spain and Cyprus. These memorandums of understanding provided hundreds of billions of euros in emergency liquidity, but the financial lifelines were strictly conditional upon the implementation of severe fiscal austerity and radical structural reforms. The underlying macroeconomic philosophy of the Troika interventions was to achieve internal devaluation. Because nominal currency devaluation was mathematically impossible within the Eurozone, peripheral nations were forced to artificially drive down domestic wages and prices to restore external competitiveness and correct their massive current account deficits. The implementation of this internal devaluation strategy fundamentally altered the traditional European social models that had been established in the post-war era. The conditionalities mandated by the Troika required radical direct interference in national collective bargaining systems, systematically dismantling centralized and sectoral collective agreements in favor of decentralized, firm-level bargaining designed to facilitate rapid downward wage flexibility. The social and economic impact of these policies was cataclysmic. In Greece, private sector real wages plummeted by 20%, while public sector wages were slashed by approximately 30% through a combination of nominal cuts and the restructuring of remuneration systems. Similar, albeit slightly less draconian measures were enacted across the periphery. Portugal saw real wages fall by 10% across the economy, accompanied by public sector wage freezes and the abolition of holiday bonuses for certain earners. Spain experienced real wage losses averaging nearly 6%, alongside public sector wage cuts and increased working hours without compensation. Italy, facing immense market pressure, implemented de facto freezes on public sector wages by refusing to renew expired collective agreements. Beyond wage compression, the austerity packages mandated severe reductions in the generosity and duration of unemployment benefits, deep cuts to healthcare and social services, and sweeping pension reforms. This aggressive macroeconomic contraction induced a deep, prolonged economic depression across South Europe. Eurostat data tracks the horrifying human cost of this internal devaluation. Unemployment in the Eurozone periphery soared to levels twice as high as the European Union average. Youth unemployment rates reached catastrophic peaks, exceeding 50% in both Greece and Spain during the darkest years of the crisis, permanently scarring a generation of workers. Policy analysts and researchers argue that these interventions constituted a top-down neoliberal restructuring program that used mass unemployment as a disciplinary mechanism to force rapid liberalization of Southern European labor markets. Comparative sociological studies indicate that while Germany underwent painful but internally negotiated labor market reforms prior to the crisis, the rapid externally imposed deregulation in Southern Europe vastly increased the long-term social and economic costs of the crisis. It dismantled the protective capacity of the welfare state, precisely when social demand for protection was at its highest, leading to systemic poverty and social exclusion that persist well into the current decade. Institutional friction, the central bank, the constitutional court, and the limits of monetary policy. The crisis management phase of the 2010s not only devastated the social fabric of the periphery, but also triggered profound institutional and constitutional friction within the core, highlighting the extreme tension between supranational monetary policy and national democratic sovereignty. As the sovereign debt crisis threatened the very survival of the euro, traditional monetary policy tools proved insufficient to halt the speculative fragmentation of European bond markets. In 2012, European Central Bank President Mario Draghi famously committed to do whatever it takes to preserve the single currency. This verbal commitment was backed by the creation of the Outright Transactions Program, and later the massive public sector purchase program, involving quantitative easing, wherein the central bank purchased trillions of euros in government bonds to flood the system with liquidity and drive down borrowing costs. These unprecedented interventions successfully stabilized sovereign bond yields and saved the monetary union from collapse, but they sparked fierce legal and political resistance, particularly in Germany. The German Federal Constitutional Court repeatedly challenged the legality of the bank's bond-buying programs, reflecting deeply ingrained national anxieties regarding hyperinflation and the backdoor mutualization of debt. This conflict culminated in an explosive and highly controversial ruling in 2020, wherein the German Constitutional Court declared aspects of the public sector purchase program ultra vires, directly defying a previous ruling by the Court of Justice of the European Union. The German court argued that the European Central Bank had failed to properly assess the proportionality of its actions. Specifically, the court contended that the central bank ignored the broader economic and social policy effects of artificially lowering borrowing costs, which allegedly distorted savings, kept economically unviable zombie companies afloat, and effectively circumvented the Europe Treaties' strict prohibition on the monetary financing of member states. Although the immediate crisis was eventually contained through diplomatic and procedural maneuvering, this monumental judicial clash exposed the fragile legal and political foundation of the Eurozone.
It demonstrated the ultimate limits of relying solely on an independent, technocratic central bank to act as the ultimate stabilizing force and substitute for a functioning, democratically accountable fiscal treasury. The geography of discontent, deindustrialization, the development trap, and the populist surge. The enduring legacy of the Eurozone crisis, combined with long-term structural changes in the global economy and the failure to achieve real convergence, fostered a deep-seated geography of discontent across the European continent. As large segments of the periphery and the deindustrializing core failed to recover their pre-crisis economic dynamism, the political landscape fragmented entirely. The dramatic rise of both right-wing and left-wing populism over the past decade cannot be understood purely as a cultural phenomenon. It is inextricably linked to regional economic stagnation, deindustrialization, and the widespread perception of a failing European economic model. Extensive macroeconomic panel data analysis and regional geographic research mapping regional development traps reveal a powerful, undeniable correlation between prolonged economic stagnation and electoral support for Eurosceptic and anti-establishment parties. A regional development trap is defined as a condition wherein a region faces significant structural challenges in retrieving past dynamism, characterized by an inability to retain economic growth in terms of income per capita, productivity, and employment relative to their national peers, the European average, and their own past trajectories. Between the 2008 financial crisis and 2022, the aggregate vote share for hard Eurosceptic parties, those fundamentally opposed to European integration, rose from less than 5% to 14%. When combined with soft Eurosceptic parties, the total vote share quadrupled to over 27%. This surge is heavily concentrated in regions suffering from these development traps,
transforming previously prosperous industrial heartlands and neglected rural areas into places that don't matter, where residents feel economically abandoned, ignored by metropolitan elites, and culturally alienated. However, detailed electoral analysis utilizing regional data at the NUTS 2 and NUTS 3 levels demonstrates that the political articulation of this discontent diverges significantly depending on the specific nature and history of the economic decline. Left-wing and right-wing populism draw strength from different economic pathologies. Left-wing populism, epitomized by the explosive rise of Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain during the 2010s, emerged primarily in direct response to acute austerity, actual long-term industrial decline, and the sudden traumatic contraction of the welfare state. In Greece, successive austerity packages that shrank social expenditure by up to 24% and pushed poverty rates to 35% catalyzed the transformation of Syriza from a fringe, heterogeneous Marxist coalition into a governing party capable of capturing the state. Driven by the intellectual and political narrative that the Troika's interventions were punitive measures designed to save core European financial institutions at the expense of the Greek periphery, Syriza mobilized mass anti-neoliberal sentiment, echoing the demands of the Indignados movement in Spain. Similarly, Podemos capitalized on the bursting of the Spanish housing bubble, the ensuing mass youth unemployment crisis, and the widespread outrage over political corruption and welfare cuts, demanding massive welfare compensation and a total rejection of European austerity politics. Conversely, right-wing populism, such as the Alternative for Germany and the National Rally in France, finds its strongest electoral support not necessarily in areas of absolute ongoing destitution, but rather in regions experiencing a relative loss of status, looming future industrial decline, and high exposure to automation risk. Empirical studies focusing on geocoded survey data in Germany indicate that support for the Alternative for Germany is highest in regions where historic manufacturing employment remains relatively high, but the threat of deindustrialization and automation is most palpable. In these areas, localized manufacturing job losses and the erosion of the industrial base invoke profound economic anxiety and are perceived as a fundamental status threat by the working class. This anxiety prompts voters to reject the liberal internationalist order, globalization, and European integration, viewing supranational governance as the vector of their economic insecurity. Thus, while the left-wing populist surge was a reactive mobilization against the dismantling of the welfare state during the Euro crisis, the ongoing systemic right-wing populist wave is deeply rooted in the structural transformation of the global economy, where workers in legacy industries vote to protect their remaining economic security against the perceived overlapping threats of free trade, migration, and the green transition. Geopolitical shocks, the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, and the end of the German business model. As Europe struggled to heal the deep economic and political fractures inflicted by the sovereign debt crisis and the ensuing populist wave, the continent was struck by consecutive paradigm-shifting external shocks, the outbreak of global COVID-19 pandemic, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. These events forced a brutal, immediate reckoning with Europe's deep strategic dependencies and initiated a profound, ongoing reimagining of the European political economy. The outbreak of full-scale conventional warfare in Ukraine in 2022 effectively destroyed the bedrock foundation of the German industrial model, which for decades had served as the primary growth engine for the entire European Union. The German economy miracle heavily relied on highly competitive, export-oriented heavy manufacturing powered by structurally cheap and abundant Russian pipeline gas. Before the conflict escalated, Russia supplied approximately 157 billion cubic meters of natural gas to the European Union in 2021, accounting for roughly half of the bloc's total gas imports, with Germany acting as the primary hub and beneficiary. The abrupt, weaponized cessation of these energy flows, dropping to a mere 38 billion cubic meters by 2025, triggered an unprecedented energy crisis across the continent. European benchmark natural gas and electricity prices skyrocketed, peaking at nearly double their historical averages, and the cost of energy abruptly shifted from an issue of reliable supply security to an existential threat to industrial affordability. This energy shock disproportionately impacted the European core. Energy-intensive industries, particularly in Germany, such as chemicals, steel, metallurgy, and heavy manufacturing, faced an immediate and catastrophic crisis of global competitiveness. The European Union's fossil fuel import bill swelled enormously, jumping from 341 billion euros in 2019 over to 416 billion euros by 2023, draining hundreds of billions of euros that could have been allocated to domestic infrastructure, innovation, and education. To prevent a total industrial collapse and widespread societal freezing, Europe engaged in a rapid, highly expensive diversification strategy. The continent heavily substituted Russian pipeline gas with imported, seaborne liquefied natural gas, predominantly sourced from the United States, which quickly accounted for 45% of imports. However, this rapid diversification merely replaced one strategic geopolitical dependency with another, exposing the European economy to the highly volatile cycles of global commodity markets, shipping constraints, and the vagaries of American domestic politics. The realization that European economic security was fundamentally inseparable from energy security prompted European leaders to reframe energy policy entirely. Achieving strategic autonomy became the continent's new guiding principle, treating energy security as a matter of wartime logistics and catalyzing a desperate acceleration towards renewable electrification as the only viable path to long-term survival. Yet the transitional economic costs remain staggering. Analysts suggest that without massive immediate grid upgrades, projected to cost hundreds of billions of euros, and the rapid deployment of clean energy generation, the structural increase in European energy costs will permanently degrade the competitiveness of the continent's manufacturing base, cementing a prolonged period of industrial stagnation. Reimagining industrial policy, state aid, the Green Industrial Deal, and the competitiveness gap. The severe European energy crisis coincided with a tectonic shift in global trade paradigms, fundamentally altering the rules of the global economy. The passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which authorized hundreds of billions of dollars in uncapped subsidies and tax credits for green technology, explicitly tied to domestic manufacturing and local content requirements, coupled with China's long-standing, heavily subsidized state capitalist dominance in solar, battery, and electric vehicle supply chains, signaled the definitive end of the neoliberal free trade consensus that Europe had long championed. Facing the imminent threat of massive capital flight, corporate relocation to North America, and the total deindustrialization of its nascent clean technology sectors, the European Union was forced to abandon its traditional, deeply held aversion to vertical industrial policy. Historically, European Union competition policy strictly limited the deployment of state aid to prevent wealthy member states from subsidizing their domestic industries, thereby preserving a level playing field and preventing market distortion within the single market. However, the sheer scale of American and Chinese industrial subsidies compelled the European Commission to enact the Green Deal Industrial Plan and introduce the Clean Industrial Deal State Aid Framework. These mechanisms drastically relaxed the stringent rules governing state subsidies, explicitly allowing national governments to inject vast amounts of public capital into industries deemed vital for the net zero transition through the end of the decade. This includes heavy subsidization for renewable energy deployment, battery cell manufacturing, nuclear technology, and the decarbonization of highly emitting heavy industries like steel and cement. Furthermore, the framework vastly expanded the use of important projects of common European interest, which permit member states to jointly fund massive cross-border innovation and infrastructure projects, such as the European Chips Act, aimed at doubling the European Union's global share of semiconductor production to 20% by 2030. While politically necessary to combat external geopolitical threats and prevent immediate deindustrialization, this aggressive pivot towards state intervention poses a severe existential threat to the internal cohesion of the European Union. The relaxation of state aid rules inherently and overwhelmingly favors member states with the deepest fiscal pockets, primarily Germany and France, allowing them to heavily subsidize their national champions. Consequently, smaller and peripheral member states, still severely constrained by high sovereign debt burdens lingering from the euro crisis, are entirely incapable of matching this fiscal firepower. Research indicates that the extreme administrative complexity and massive capital requirements of mechanisms like important projects of common European interest predominantly benefit large incumbent corporations located in the core, effectively shutting out small and medium-sized enterprises and widening the economic divide between the core and the periphery. This dynamic threatens to fundamentally fracture the single market, replacing open, rules-based competition with a destructive subsidy race that replicates the macroeconomic imbalances of the early 2000s under the guise of the green transition. The extreme urgency of this competitiveness crisis was starkly outlined in the landmark 2024 economic reports authored by former Italian Prime Ministers Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta. The Draghi report delivered a devastating diagnosis of the European economy, concluding that Europe is trapped in a static industrial structure characterized by an acute innovation deficit, a lack of corporate scale, and a chronic inability to translate cutting-edge research into commercial dominance. Draghi highlighted the alarming statistic that not a single European company valued at over 100 billion euros has been created from scratch in the past 50 years, contrasting sharply with the technological behemoths of the United States and China, who dominate the global tech sector. Both Draghi and Letta emphasized that the regulatory fragmentation of the European market prevents companies from scaling up, and that the continent faces an insurmountable annual investment gap of roughly 800 billion euros required to finance decarbonization, digitalization, and defense rearmament. To overcome this gap, the reports advocated for the urgent completion of the Capital Markets Union, rebranded as the Savings and Investments Union, to channel Europe's vast dormant private savings into productive investments, and, critically, the issuance of new common European debt to finance a centralized European competitiveness fund, thereby avoiding the single market fragmentation caused by relying solely on national state aid. The automotive sector serves as the most critical and highly visible test case for this industrial transformation. Generating 7% of the European Union's gross domestic product, accounting for 170 billion euros in exports and employing nearly 14 million people, the European automotive industry is currently navigating a highly perilous transition to zero-emission mobility. Automakers face fierce competition from heavily subsidized, technologically advanced Chinese electric vehicles, while simultaneously grappling with high domestic energy and labor costs. With extremely stringent European Union tailpipe emission limits coming into full effect, industry leaders have warned of up to 16 billion euros in potential fines, massive production cuts, and devastating job losses if consumer demand for electric vehicles remains stagnant due to inadequate charging infrastructure and high purchase prices. The industry's desperate struggle epitomizes the broader European macroeconomic dilemma. how to mandate a rapid, regulatory-driven green transition without systematically destroying the foundational pillars of continental industrial prosperity. Next Generation EU, defense rearmament, and the resurgence of the fiscal union debate. The sheer magnitude of the public investment required to execute the green transition, ensure economic security, and fund the suddenly pressing need for continental defense rearmament following the invasion of Ukraine has reignited the fiercely contested perennial debate over European fiscal integration. During the darkest depths of the COVID-19 pandemic, the European Union crossed a historic psychological and institutional Rubicon with the creation of Next Generation EU, a massive €800 billion recovery instrument financed for the first time by debt issued jointly by the European Commission on behalf of the entire bloc. Next Generation EU was widely celebrated as a Hamiltonian moment that finally injected a meaningful, albeit temporary, fiscal capacity into the economic and monetary union. It fundamentally altered the dynamics of European solidarity. Rather than imposing punitive, pro-cyclical austerity seen during the sovereign debt crisis, Next Generation EU provided massive structural grants and highly favorable loans to the hardest-hit peripheral countries, notably Italy and Spain, aimed at digital modernization and the green transition. Real-time economic estimates demonstrated that the mere announcement of this mutualized debt instrument significantly lowered sovereign risk premiums across the periphery, driving down borrowing costs and stabilizing the fractured monetary union without relying entirely on the central bank. However, the profound question of whether Next Generation EU represents a temporary emergency measure or the foundational blueprint for a permanent European fiscal capacity remains the most contentious issue in European economic politics. The architecture of the European Union's new fiscal framework, updated in 2024, attempted to find a middle ground by reintroducing binding fiscal paths through medium-term fiscal structural plans, demanding gradual debt reduction back toward the 60% benchmark while supposedly protecting and encouraging public investment. The tension within these new rules is acute and politically explosive. Germany, traditionally the unwavering anchor of European fiscal conservatism, recently underwent a historic domestic political reversal. Acknowledging years of chronic self-imposed underinvestment resulting in deteriorating infrastructure, a stagnating economy, and the urgent need to rebuild its dilapidated military capabilities in the face of a wavering United States security umbrella, Berlin took unprecedented steps to effectively circumvent its constitutionally enshrined debt brake. The German government proposed massive new investment funds for defense and green infrastructure, adopting fiscal adjustments that heavily backload consolidation and rely on highly optimistic, bordering on unrealistic economic growth projections. The European Commission's subsequent endorsement of Germany's expansionary fiscal plan, despite its clear deviation from the strict interpretation of the European Union's debt-to-GDP benchmark, exposes a profound political double standard. Observers and analysts note that this blatant leniency towards a core nation threatens to entirely undermine the credibility of the new fiscal framework, as peripheral nations that were subjected to brutal economy-destroying austerity a decade prior now observe the rules bending seamlessly for the continent's largest economy.
This fiscal hypocrisy is unfolding alongside the rapid development of the Security Action for Europe instrument, a massive new €150 billion loan facility designed to urgently ramp up the European defense industry, mitigate critical capability gaps, and reduce reliance on non-European military suppliers. The Security Action for Europe framework relies on leveraging the European Union budget headroom and utilizing national escape clauses within the Stability and Growth Pact
to allow member states to boost defense spending without violating deficit rules. The overarching, undeniable reality is that Europe cannot simultaneously fund the green transition, rebuild its industrial base, rearm its militaries against Russian aggression, and adhere to strict fiscal conservatism without establishing permanent, centralized mechanisms for joint borrowing. Yet the German Constitutional Court maintains stringent oversight, explicitly ruling that next-generation EU cannot legally evolve into a permanent mechanism of mutualized liability without violating the democratic sovereignty of the German parliament, placing a severe, perhaps insurmountable legal ceiling on the evolution of a true European fiscal union. The agricultural backlash, the Green Deal, the Common Agricultural Policy, and the 2024 protests. The top-down transition to a highly regulated, decarbonized economy has not only caused severe friction within the industrial and automotive sectors, but has also sparked massive civic unrest, culminating in the widespread continent-spanning European farmer protests of 2024. The agricultural sector, historically the most heavily subsidized, regulated, and politically protected element of the European economy via the Common Agricultural Policy, emerged as the primary, highly mobilized battleground against the implementation of the European Green Deal. Throughout early 2024, millions of farmers mobilized across France, Germany, Poland, Spain, Italy, and Belgium, utilizing heavy agricultural machinery and tractors to physically blockade highways, international border crossings, and major economic arteries such as ports and capital city centers. The protests were driven by a highly volatile confluence of economic pressures and restrictive regulatory mandates. Farmers cited rapidly rising input costs for fuel and fertilizer, exacerbated by the energy crisis, falling supermarket commodity prices, and the crushing administrative bureaucracy imposed by the European Union's ambitious farm-to-fork and biodiversity strategies. Specific environmental regulations, particularly mandates requiring farmers to leave a percentage of their productive arable land fallow to restore biodiversity, alongside strict binding targets for the drastic reduction of chemical pesticides and fertilizers, were universally viewed by the agricultural community as existential threats to their livelihoods and economic viability. Furthermore, the geopolitical imperatives of the broader Polycrisis directly collided with domestic agricultural interests, exacerbating the fury. Following the invasion of Ukraine, the European Union's decision to suspend import tariffs and quotas on Ukrainian agricultural products to support Kiev's war-torn economy resulted in a massive, uncontrolled influx of cheap Ukrainian grain, poultry, and sugar into neighboring Eastern European countries, notably Poland and Romania. This flood of imports severely undercut local market prices, driving local farmers toward bankruptcy. Simultaneously, farmers across the continent voiced vehement, coordinated opposition to the proposed finalization of the European Union-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement, fearing that they would be forced out of business by a flood of cheap South American agricultural imports produced without adhering to the European Union's highly stringent, costly environmental and animal welfare standards. The sheer scale, logistical coordination, and disruptive power of the farmer protests, occurring mere months before the highly consequential 2024 European Parliament elections, terrified the European establishment. Recognizing the extremely high risk that this deep rural discontent would be fully co-opted by right-wing populist and Eurosceptic parties seeking to weaponize the backlash against the entire climate agenda, the European Commission engaged in a rapid, substantive, and highly public capitulation. In a shocking reversal of its flagship environmental agenda, the Commission officially scrapped the proposed Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive, significantly diluted the binding targets within the Nature Restoration Law, and suspended the implementation of the highly contested fallow land mandates.
National governments simultaneously scrambled to quell the unrest by offering hundreds of millions of euros in emergency national subsidies and targeted tax breaks. This sudden, sweeping policy reversal underscored a profound and enduring vulnerability within the European political economy. The technocratic, top-down implementation of the Green Deal can be rapidly unraveled when the economic costs of the transition are perceived to be disproportionately burdening traditional, highly organized sectors of the working class. It revealed that without a comprehensive, democratically negotiated strategy to manage the socio-economic distribution of transition costs, the overarching goal of European climate neutrality remains highly susceptible to democratic veto and popular revolt.
Vulnerabilities of the modern European political economy. The political economy of Europe from the signing of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 to the present day is defined by the agonizing, ongoing struggle to manage the inherent contradictions of a partially integrated continent. The foundational decision to forge a monetary union without a corresponding fiscal treasury or political union created an inherently unstable macroeconomic architecture that systematically favored the export-driven core nations over the debt-reliant peripheral nations. When the global financial crisis shattered the illusion of nominal convergence, the resulting imposition of severe austerity and internal devaluation inflicted profound, lasting damage on the traditional European social model. It generated a deep reservoir of regional economic stagnation and deindustrialization that continues to fuel both left-wing and right-wing populist movements, permanently fragmenting the European political landscape. Today, as Europe confronts the unrelenting pressures of the Polycrisis, characterized by the devastating loss of the cheap Russian energy that sustained its industrial base, the traumatic return of conventional warfare to its borders, and the total fracturing of the global free trade consensus, the European Union is being forced into a radical, historically necessary evolution. The transition from a horizontal, rules-based single market focused on internal competition toward an assertive, state interventionist geopolitical bloc is rapidly underway. This paradigm shift is starkly evidenced by the sweeping relaxation of state aid rules, the implementation of the Green Deal industrial plan, the desperate push for defense rearmament, and the historic precedent-setting issuance of joint mutualized debt under next-generation EU. However, this necessary transformation is fraught with immense structural risk. Relying on national state aid to compete globally against the United States and China threatens to permanently fracture the single market by empowering the wealthiest member states at the direct expense of the periphery, recreating the very imbalances that sparked the Eurozone crisis. Simultaneously, the massive public investments required to restore industrial competitiveness, achieve strategic autonomy, and complete the green transition clash violently with the legal, constitutional, and political remnants of fiscal conservatism in the core, as well as the democratic resistance of populations unwilling to bear the immediate, highly disruptive costs of decarbonization. The survival, cohesion, and future prosperity of the European project depend entirely on whether its institutions can successfully synthesize these deeply competing imperatives, establishing a permanent, centralized fiscal capacity that ensures global industrial competitiveness while simultaneously guaranteeing internal economic equity and social stability in the 21st century.